been a while since I last covered LoreFi, the currently ongoing alternate reality game contained within the genre of lo-fi music, created by none other than MatPat himself. Since we last talked about it, there have been 3 additions to the YouTube content and several song releases, all of which bring us closer and closer to unraveling the lore and the truth of what is happening to Taylor, the teenager under surveillance, and Gregory Daniels, the missing 12-year-old who has supposedly been kidnapped. In this episode, we investigate all of the recent releases to see what conclusions we can come to. First, let's talk about the third main episode release, a short video titled Ignorance is Bliss. The thumbnail is one of the more startling ones, with Taylor backed up against a set of purple lockers, and the shadow of what appears to be a man holding a knife or a sharp object into the air, the positioning of the shadow clearly indicating malice or harm to be the man's intentions. That, and the fact that Taylor looks very concerned here. The weird thing is, nothing like this occurs in the episode's animation at all. There is indeed a stressful scenario happening in proximity to the lockers, but certainly no attack by a man with a weapon is seen. This leads me to believe that what we're seeing in the thumbnail may need to be taken less literally, at least for now. This type of representational imagery for cover art is seen commonly in books and comic books, depicting scenes that haven't literally happened but represent the scenario at hand. I think this thumbnail is simply meant to remind us of the fact that Taylor is in danger at the hands of a, as of yet, unseen enemy, perhaps signifying that the urgency of the danger is ramping up a bit. Turning to the description, we get the sentence, "It's too bad it doesn't last long." This is undoubtedly referring to the phrase ignorance is bliss, the title of the episode, and following up on it. Ignorance is bliss means that lacking knowledge can be conducive to increased happiness. For instance, let's say there is a very real threat to your life that just narrowly didn't kill you. If you were never aware that the threat existed, you wouldn't have felt anything negative. You would have just lived your life as though nothing had ever been wrong. But if you had always been aware of this potential threat, it would have no doubt caused you intense anxiety and fear. This is just a simple hypothetical, but I think it gets the point across. Not knowing something isn't always a good thing, but it can be a happier thing. The rest of the description centers around code cracking, which I'll openly admit I have way less interest and talent in solving, and as such, I leave the more advanced code decryption to the investigators contributing to the big glorified Discord Google document. I'm currently displaying the process and explanation on screen. The answer that can be ultimately derived are 3 words: DuPage, Cook, and Will, which are all counties around the area of southwest Chicago as seen on the map here. This shows setting consistency and perhaps relates to the journey that has been hinted at. The episode's animation content begins with Taylor leaning against a set of purple lockers in what is probably her high school hallway, listening to music on her headphones as she so often does. Taylor is seen nearby more butterfly imagery and shadows of people passing by move across the surface of the lockers. Out of seemingly nowhere, the screen darkens as a message from none other than Gregory begins to play, turning out to be the bleakest moment in LoreFi so far. This is the message.
Been kidnapped, and I confess that I. Please, just let me go home. Please, I'm begging. No, no.
The beginning of the message is what we heard at the start of the very first official episode of LoreFi, so clearly this is an extenuation of that one. He seems to be being forced into confessing something, and since we have very little information on what it is he is meant to be confessing, I'm not sure if whatever it is would be even true or not, or some manipulation by his captors. Interestingly, before the video ends, a distorted voice is heard saying, "Confess." This happens after a moment of silence, indicating that I think it may be separate from the original Gregory recording, which then lends itself to the idea that is meant to be said directly to Taylor. The episode ends abruptly immediately following this, along with a gasp from Taylor. The whole segment being so focused on coercing a confession does link back to the thematic material already present in the series, that being the themes of sinning, of stealing, and deceiving that have been hinted at through ciphers and biblical references. As of yet, it can be merely speculated as to what is needing to be confessed. Our determined knowledge of wrongdoing on Taylor's part is currently limited to the high probability that she is stealing music to download, and we don't really have any solid proof that Gregory is doing anything that would merit any kind of dramatic confession. An interesting thing to bring up that could potentially be a point of contention is whether or not Taylor was legitimately hearing this or is experiencing some sort of memory or trauma. Either way, her peaceful music listening was interrupted. As I can see it, there are two ways of approaching this scene. Either Taylor is very aware that she is guilty of something and is directly connected to the Gregory case, given that she can recall his words, or somehow that audio was in amongst her lo-fi music that she suddenly heard. Personally, I find the latter to be far more likely. You can physically see that she was substantially startled, which could be explained by a panic attack or something adjacent, but I think it just makes a little more sense to be a reaction to something occurring in real time. Perhaps what convinces me most of this are some evidence points that appear later in the third iteration of the 24/7 livestream. The fact that Taylor now seems to be very interested in the Gregory case, and the fact that Seffi is asking why a kidnapped kid is in her song. Up until now, newspapers concerning Gregory's disappearance have been lazily tossed in Taylor's trash, which is not indicative of someone who is invested in a case, which has led me to believe she hadn't been all that connected to Gregory prior to his disappearance despite living nearby. So why the change of heart now? Why does she suddenly care enough to replace a movie tape with a tape on information surrounding Gregory? Why pin the newspaper on her corkboard now? Something had to have happened, and I think Taylor and Seffi have both heard this bleak message from Gregory and are now trying to figure out what to do about it. The question now becomes, who exactly was this message intended for? Was it meant to be directly received by Taylor, or is Taylor getting wrapped up in someone else's mess? If Seffi and Taylor indeed heard the same thing, then that does make it seem as though it was less of a specifically targeted message to either one of them, unless they were both the intended recipients, of course. Technically, we don't have any proof that both Taylor and Seffi heard the same thing, just that they both have encountered audio concerning the kidnapped kid. This episode was good for plot progression as Taylor is now invested in the disappearance of Gregory, Seffi is wrapped up in whatever conspiracy is going on here, and we have more of a sense of urgency surrounding the danger that has been primarily lurking in the shadows. From there, the next installment comes in the form of a fall 2024 collection. There isn't a lot new here, as it is just a collection, and the messages that appear in our computer I'll talk about in the next section when I cover the communications Taylor has recently been engaging with. One notable thing is that Taylor's bear stuffed animal is propped to be looking out the window, which is perhaps related to Taylor's note to "Don't look." On the subject, I don't think I mentioned in last video, there is a car and a shadowy figure that occasionally slowly pass by Taylor's window, which may be of some significance. Again, this could all be to indicate that Taylor is not only being watched from her web camera, but also physically through her window. This creates a terrifying situation where Taylor is effectively being stalked from all angles, whilst in the safety of her own home. The next bulk of exciting additions to the lore comes with the third iteration of the 24/7 livestream, where we can see plenty of new messages on Taylor's computer, some changes around the room, and new clues hidden within the songs, as well as a weirdly coincidental rabbit hole I fell down amidst my investigation into LoreFi. If you're watching this, then you probably enjoy stories, and one of the best ways of consuming stories is through books. I have been writing and self publishing fictional novels to Amazon for years, under the broad umbrella of science fiction, but also containing elements of fantasy and mystery as well. If you're in the mood for high concept sci fi, then books like Linear Highway or Genesis Prince of Time should hit the spot. If you are more into unraveling a mystery, Frameless Mirror or What's Gone Before should be ideal. Or, if you are into themes of spiritual horror, Cult of Shadows has a soul shaking story to get lost in. Of course, there is always the option to dive into the entirety of the Lloyd Salt series and the broader universe it takes place in to fully experience its vast and ever-expanding lore. Furthermore, if you prefer to listen to audiobooks rather than read, if you show your support to the channel by becoming a member of the Amateur Sleuth tier or above, you will have access to the audiobook versions of my novels, which I update with new episodes weekly. The first reading is of my book-length fanfiction based around the Petscop web series. Links are in the description. Thank you to anyone who considers investing in my writing, and now back to the investigation. The third livestream adds several interesting points of discussion to LoreFi. The description now has a fancy and foreboding font where it says we hope you enjoy your time with LoreFi, and one of the tags said Prologue End, indicating that the series has just been getting started and things will only ramp up from here. There is a string of base 64 text that when deciphered reads, "You think you have a chance? Very well, let the games begin, sinner." The word sinner is a callback to when we found that word hidden in a code from a prior episode. At this time, it is difficult to understand who is speaking here or why, or who the intended recipient of this even is, but if I had to guess, I would say this is a message from our hacker to Taylor, My reasoning for this stemming from the fact that a message of a similar taunting nature can be seen in the console at one point on Taylor's computer when it's taking actions without her interference, this one saying, "You want to play in the big leagues? Let's play." Interestingly, this console also has "duck, duck, duck, goose" printed onto it. This makes me think back to the "tag your it" message from earlier on, in that it is strengthening the idea that Taylor is the latest target of this virus and whatever consequences that entails. Based on these new messages, if I had to guess, Taylor accidentally provoked something she shouldn't have, probably by stealing the music, and is now trapped amongst an ugly situation. It is still exceedingly unclear how Gregory's kidnapping ties into anything going on with Taylor, the hacker, and her presumed stalkers. Around the room, we can see that more stuff has fallen off of the corkboard, and several things have been moved around or tampered with, displaying another at least minimal lapse of time since last stream. As mentioned earlier, one of the biggest things the current room tells us is that Taylor is very invested in the Gregory case. She also has stuffed her backpack with what appear to be art canvases, which goes along with her talent for art and her ambitions surrounding it. A particular point of interest is their much more visible newspaper concerning Gregory, which reads, headline, "Missing Boy's Backpack Found." Body, "Police still stumped. Backpack of Gregory Daniels missing since last December. Has been found near Mallard Lake this weekend. Hanover Park Police Department shut down the area and are continuing the search, hoping to find more evidence that might help find the missing 12-year-old. While the HPPD did not comment on if they have found anything else, a representative stated that officers are being thorough. According to sources, and we can't see any more of the article from that point on. We now know that Gregory was kidnapped in the month of December, and given that there's absolutely no snow or sign of cold outside of Taylor's window, something that should be present in Illinois during the winter months, and the fact that a yearbook sitting on Taylor's desk includes teachers and friends writing sentiments about seeing her next school year, I think it is safe to say a substantial amount of time has passed since Gregory first disappeared, specifically a few months. The fact that his backpack was recovered could indicate that he was taken while on his way either to or from school or something similar, as that is when a 12-year-old is most likely to be wearing a backpack. It being left behind also probably shows that he was abducted quite quickly. Meanwhile, Taylor's computer is still moving on its own via the hacker, and we can see it view several online news articles concerning Gregory. We only get to see the headlines, but here we get confirmation that Gregory has indeed been missing for months, that police are baffled and have little to no leads, and that there was at least initially some discourse over whether or not he had been kidnapped or simply ran away. Interestingly, Taylor's blinds are much more closed than before, and there is a sock over her webcam. This must suggest that Taylor is now at least somewhat aware that she is being watched through her webcam and window, and she has taken small steps to resist against that. We also have already seen that she has plans to either fix or replace her computer, as well as in past installments. You might notice that there is a blue note with some Morse code on it on Taylor's corkboard, which leads to another troll link. If you want, go check it out, I won't spoil it. More relevant Morse code messages can be seen when the lights hanging in her room flash. Two distinct messages can be deciphered from this blinking Morse code: "just went off" and "goblet." If these are the intended words, I am not sure as of yet how they correlate to anything. Now we get to the various messages that appear on Taylor's computer throughout the stream. Like we mentioned before, Sephi is hearing Gregory in her songs just as it seemed Taylor did in Ignorance is Bliss, and we get to witness her panicking, then calming herself down through the messages. Strangely, we see "I just checked" and "no, not on the song," which I can only take to mean that the Gregory audio isn't on the official song, and this is a more of a personalized copy type scenario. Now we have to grapple with the question as to why both Taylor and Sephi are being targeted to hear this, and why at least Taylor is being prompted to confess something. Sephi calms herself down by offering the solution that someone named Wing is pranking them, to which we see that Taylor has friended Wing of Disharmony, who is probably the user Sephi was referring to. There hasn't been much interaction between them as of yet. On the topic of messages, something I missed from the second iteration of the livestream is that some messages from Kate would glitch out to display different text. For instance, "OMG, my section looks great, thank you," turns into, "Tay, I don't want to be that person, but I haven't gotten my section from you." Also, "Received my section from you, thanks," turns into, "I never got it." This could honestly explain why there seemed to be some weirdness between them in the third livestream, despite the fact that it seems Taylor did indeed cave in and do her part of the project. I'm going to be honest, this is really weird. I do not understand why the hacker, who is the only one I can imagine to be capable of altering the messages Taylor is receiving, would be doing this of all things. Like, to what end? What purpose does this serve? At this point in time, it seems LoreFi as a series is more concerned with setting up questions than answers, and if these past few months have indeed served as a type of prologue, I suppose that makes sense. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is a rabbit hole that I fell down whilst investigating LoreFi, something that I have come to believe isn't actually connected to anything, but is such a crazy coincidence that I need to bring it up. So it all started with this message Taylor receives from Kev that says, "You good? What does Base 64 Timmy mean?" Naturally, the first thing I did was run in all caps Timmy through a Base 64 translator. Given that Timmy starts as such a coherent and recognizable English word, I opted to encode into Base 64 rather than decode as we have historically done throughout this series. This results in Vane TV K equals. Now, admittedly, K equals doesn't neatly fit, but Vane being an actual word and TV being short version for television, I decided to throw the phrase into the search bar and see what I could find. I actually found a website to a death metal band called Vane.fm, whose website link possesses the exact phrase of Vane TV. Upon looking into this band, I found that they split into another called Fleshwater, whose logo is none other than a creepy duck, and they even have a couple of songs with the word virus in the title. Now, given that I cannot scrounge up any other additional evidence to support that this is in any way the correct line of research, or how any of it could possibly connect to LoreFi, I'm currently convinced that this was all just a wild coincidence. Furthermore, both Vane and Fleshwater's inception as bands take place years after LoreFi is supposed to be taking place, meaning that the Base 64 Timmy thing that Kev is asking Taylor about cannot canonically be tied to either band, so if it were to be some sort of clue, we'd have to have an entire separate explanation for the in-universe meaning of the message, while deciphering the more meta storytelling that could only be meant for the audience to glean potential information from. All this makes it seem incredibly unlikely that Vane or Fleshwater are at all connected to LoreFi storytelling, but it was a funny rabbit hole to go down nonetheless. That being said, I would then have no idea what this message about Base 64 Timmy is supposed to mean and why Kev is asking Taylor about it, suggesting some prior communication Taylor sent over to him concerning Base 64 Timmy. Another thing I actually do want to mention before closing out this video is a recent spectrogram that appeared in the song Loading Screens displays a two of hearts from a deck of cards. This could potentially relate to certain cardomancy superstitions around playing cards, such as the idea that a two of hearts represents the concept of love and harmony, or a deep connection between two people, usually relating to some form of love. Given that this series has already used several religious, biblical, and superstitious allusions to give clues to the thematic material of the story, I think this is a fine way of interpreting the spectrogram. Perhaps it is meant to portray the relationship between two people in the story. Perhaps the rift that needs to be healed between Taylor and her father, perhaps a bond between Taylor and one of the various other characters that have appeared only by username, and maybe even a kinship between Taylor and Gregory somehow. Hopefully we'll be getting more content from LoreFi soon and an increased volume of information that we can more solidly theorize on. For now, the unknown persists, so the investigation continues.